What's up guys, my name's SPLICE and welcome back to Reflections. Today we'll be talking about one of the topics that I feel like has really started to gather a lot of steam lately on the internet, and that's this idea that RWBY is declining in quality. I won't disagree necessarily with some of the points that have been made on either side, saying that it's improved or it hasn't. What I will say is that RWBY is definitely not what it used to be, in particular when Monty was part of the team, and I don't mean to say this that the team isn't as capable without him. I'm just going to say that they don't focus on the same things as he does. And you can see this in a number of different ways, whereas the original, first of all, was done in Poser versus what it is done in now, which is actually Maya, which is a totally different program. It functions differently, and the overall physics of the actual engine work in such a way where you have to plan a lot of stuff out extra in a different way, and you have to essentially incorporate and expect a lot of things to happen on their own. They're very much, okay, this is how I want things to react, but then I have to kind of just let it react the way it will. So that's just something that you have to understand going through, that there are different systems, there are different things that you have to account for. But going into more specifics, the way that RWBY has changed is that the balance has dramatically shifted. And what I mean by that is when you first saw the red, white, black, and yellow trailers in the original before RWBY even came out, what was hugely prominent in these was the less than story-focused narrative, the idea of telling through actions, the style of the fights, and of course, something that I really have to hit on, the fact that they were more fight-centric as opposed to any sort of narrative or dialogue-centric. And when you look at the current, the updated versions of these trailers, the shift is dramatically different. You have the fact that, for example, the black trailer originally was 90% action, adrenaline-fueled energy, whereas the black trailer that is current is much more dialogue and walking, and there's not so much a lot of action to it. And this actually has to do a lot with the narrative focus that they've essentially shifted to. This isn't to say that the narrative has improved or gotten worse or any which way. It's more to point out the fact that it's a matter of balance. And the balance has shifted. When Monty left, the shift was dramatic. You can see that they deliberately don't focus on the same things, whereas Monty was telling through fights. The style and the approach to directing the fights is vastly different, which has a lot to do with Monty and the fight choreographer that he worked with very closely, having also departed. So those two huge members of the team left, and it shifted the general direction that RWBY went in. And I don't say that to say like Monty's vision has essentially been corrupted. I'm saying that it's changed the way that it's being executed. I feel like I have to continue to emphasize the fact that it's not ruining RWBY or it's ruining whatever. I'm saying it's changing it. And not everybody's going to be okay with that change, because originally it was, as I said, the fights that were the main focus, interspersed with quick, snappy dialogue that followed the same sort of pacing as the fights, and the ability to sort of juggle different emotions and feelings and feel like there's more of flow as there is to the fights, and just general dialogue in the entire scope is handled well. And those that are sometimes a little bit more cringy and difficult to deal with in the earlier animations are balanced out by an approach that is humorous, whereas the more modern interpretation has a totally different approach. Whereas the fights were definitely the main focus of the original 3 volumes, the last 2 have been hugely focused on story, and it's been way more evident. And this is actually something that people bring up all the time. They mention that all the characters haven't really done much fighting, even though there definitely have been a couple of fights. Some people are very critical of them. They say they're not as good, they're not as technical, they're not as whatever. The fact of the matter is, they're not being shot and directed in the same way, And I know that's something that might not necessarily translate that easily, given that it's a 3D medium, it's not actual people. But what I mean by that is what you're seeing in the fight scenes. For example, when it was Monty who was running the show, he had a distinct habit of doing a more follow the action as it is relevant to the narrative, as well as naturally only cutting away when you absolutely had to. And this is actually something that movies like John Wick and The Matrix do phenomenally well, is that they do not cut away from the action, which is the typical action trope, is to cut the action up so much you can't actually tell what's going on. And it gives this synthetic, fake feeling to a lot of the fight scenes. And the problem for a lot of people, I find, is the fact that we went from essentially John Wick style fighting to your typical anime slash Hollywood fight scene style cut and just tearing apart of the actual fights, to essentially more emphasize singular hits as opposed to the actual flow and motion of the actual fights. Now that is the difference between the two fights for the most part, but also something that is evident in the current version of RWBY that I think really needs to be, first of all, addressed and better handled just in a directing format, is the fact that, and I don't know if this is a budgeting concern or what have you, but they have a tendency to cut away from fights or drop them into a cliffhanger or something, so that all the momentum they've been building towards a kind of fight or any sort of confrontation is almost undercut by returning to a more narrative focus. This is shown even when they're all in the same room fighting. The fights and the physical elements of each of these scenes is so brief that you don't get a sense of really being immersed.
I'm angry.
In fact, there were points where Yang kicked ass, and that was really prominent. There were points where Hazel and Oscar were in a fight scene as Ozpin. That was really prominent. And then, of course, you also had the Maiden versus Maiden fight with Cinder and Raven. And you have those fights, and you realize, okay, so they do still have some understanding of the flow of fights, as most people will say that the Maiden versus Maiden fight was phenomenal, and it is a demonstration of the team going back to their roots and their understanding of fight scenes, in that it was primarily a lot of single shots following the narrative as it is appropriate and not cutting away unless they absolutely had to. Which I think in this particular event led more to the fact that it was two incredibly strong characters fighting, and if you only showed the close-ups, you wouldn't get a better sense of how strong these characters are. Now, of course, that isn't addressing all the minor concerns that do come up, whether you have problems with the fact that the narrative isn't necessarily as strong as you think it was. Something I would like to point out in support of their writing is that they've definitely been putting a lot more focus into their writing. They've been putting a lot more focus on a lot of the plot elements, and that's what they've really been focusing on. The problem being that when they were originally in the first three, it was pretty solid. Their moments were there for certain levels of pacing that were effective, and they were broken up enough by fights and other things that allowed you to breathe and feel like it's not just hitting you over the head with exposition or dialogue all the time, so that it doesn't feel like you're essentially just watching an infomercial at times, which I feel like is a lot of the people's concern who watch it. They feel like they're getting so much information, and sometimes repeat information in ways that don't really add to the story that much, and that's where their concern lies. And I understand that, but I also understand from the narrative perspective that there are some things they want to make as prominent as possible, so that when events happen in the future, you have no excuse not to understand these things. I'm hoping that is what their intent is, but again, I don't know necessarily what they're thinking, how they're approaching things, or anything of that regard. So I could be completely wrong. Now, what I will say is there were a lot of things that were left to a lot of people's chagrin that were essentially built up to, and then it felt like a lot of the momentum was spoiled. Now, one of those things that people have a complaint about is, of course, the way that Adam Taurus was dealt with in the season 5, volume 5, whatever you want to call it. They felt that the way that Adam was dealt with in a narrative sense was weak, and it felt like it did a disservice to a lot of what's been built up this whole time. And the fact that they've essentially cheapened his character by misnomering a lot of his motivations and destroying a lot of the strong base that was there. Now, those complaints exist. I don't know if I necessarily 100% agree with them. I can see where a lot of those opinions come from, and I can see why it would upset a lot of people. Myself, I want to see how it plays out, whether or not this ends up leading Adam into darker territory, or where he will only focus on the White Fang now that we've had this sort of post-Blake issue dealt with, as some have put it. And going forward, I would like to say there are some things that I think need to be better dealt with. Obviously, the reunion between Blake and Yang, I think, was done in such a way that felt cheapened to me, personally, but again, that is just the fact that there is narrative that still needs to be explored, and hopefully they need to deal with a lot of the underlying issues that are still clearly present in the narrative, as well as obviously the cutting away from and cheapening a lot of the fights that are done. I do still appreciate when they go wholesale on their fights and they aren't afraid to essentially hold back and have their opinions fully out there, and their ability to really demonstrate their skill when it comes to orchestrating a fight scene. I mean, there have definitely been some examples of some great fight scenes, but it feels like a lot of them have been undercut and or just not shown when they definitely had the opportunity to do so, in order to build a more succinct feeling of tension within the actual narrative. For example, the whole cheapening of hitting the Bat Faunus kid with a tray definitely could have been handled better. It could have shown maybe Kali's fighting prowess, because they do send in essentially a Faunus militant in order to take her down, and they do end up taking out a bunch of regular people that are there to defend her, and she's suddenly able to deal with him with a tray. I would love to have seen some sort of application or demonstration of her ability with that tray, or how exactly this ended up being what actually happened. I felt like they just kind of wrote it off as something that needed to happen, and I personally find that to be a bit of a sign of a little bit of weak writing, and I don't like criticizing the show wholesale myself personally, because I feel like there's a lot of stuff there that has been dropped in order to strengthen and service the story down the line. Now, whether or not this is good enough for you, that depends. There's definitely a lot of change that has happened. Now, do I think it's good or bad? That depends, I think, on the audience. Now, you have the problem of the fact that a lot of the original RWBY audience was there for the fight scenes. The beautifully orchestrated John Wick-style fight scenes that showed more than told. And now you have a shift to more of a tell more than show style of narrative. And the fact of the matter is, that's going to appeal to different people than it did in the original series. Now, what I mean by that is those who came for the fight scenes and kind of tolerated the dialogue are now forced to tolerate the fight scenes and be fully immersed in the dialogue. And given that those are two completely different attitudes, and the comedy that made the bridging of the two that much easier is a lot harder to find, it's a lot more serious of a tone now, they are essentially setting themselves out for a challenge if they don't get more comfortable with demonstrating what they're able to do, and don't cheapen a lot of the fights by cutting away from them, finding a way to make them less valuable as fights. Be able to be multi-layered with what they're doing, and don't be afraid to experiment. I mean, obviously, you want to keep it in a way that's servicing the narrative and also demonstrating the skills of the animators that you have on, because we know you have skilled animators. We've seen some of the fight scenes that you've allowed them to actually create. So don't be afraid to let that happen more often. I mean, I think it'll definitely be better received by the RWBY audience, who may or may not feel as though the fight scenes have been cheapened as time went on. You'll also have the benefit of the more beautiful visual style that you've adopted, which is another difference going from Poser to Maya, is the fact that while Poser was a little bit less polished looking, the fight scenes were crisper, stronger, and more poignant, whereas you have a more beautiful, visually appealing version of the show now, with less snappy and cohesive feeling fights. And that is something that will be addressed in some form or regard in the future. At least I hope so. Going forward, you have to hope that they're not blind to the interests of their audience and see that it's being shifted, whether or not they're okay with this and what they're going to do with it. We'll have to see. Thanks so much for watching, guys, though. My name is Splice Knight, and if you guys have any counter opinions, points you want to make, things maybe I haven't addressed that you think I should address in a follow-up video, let me know in those comments down below. But if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell so you know of any future videos that I make. Don't forget to follow me on social media, because I will be all over that all the time. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all over the place. Don't forget to follow me there so you can talk to me and, of course, open up a bigger narrative there where I'll be able to respond more openly and more consistently. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching again. My name's Splice Knight, and I'm out.